Let's talk some history. Today I want to cover Agent Orange, an herbicide used during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange came out of a military chemical warfare campaign called Operation Ranch Hand. Tested first in the Florida Everglades and Puerto Rico, it ensured that chemical herbicides would improve visibility by killing plant life by 100%. For 10 years, from 1961 to 1971, the U.S. sprayed a slew of herbicides across more than 4.5 million acres in Vietnam. These herbicides not only ruined forest cover, but also crops that the Viet Cong and northern Vietnamese relied on for food, also poisoned water supplies. In total, 20 million gallons of herbicides were used not only in Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia. And this chemical was dropped by both airplane like this and vehicle. So what is Agent Orange and how did it get its name? It was just one of the herbicides that was dropped and sprayed across the 4.5 million acres. And it got its name from the orange band around the 55-gallon drum that the herbicide was kept in. Agent Orange was the most widely used and also the most potent of the many chemicals in the U.S. arsenal. There were also varieties of Agent Orange: Agent Orange 2, Agent Orange 3, and Super Orange. What was different and dangerous about Agent Orange is it had a dioxin in it called TCDD. Now, it's important to note here that the U.S. didn't add this dioxin to Agent Orange. It was a byproduct of manufacturing herbicides. But the TCDD in Agent Orange was the most dangerous. And I'm not going to show images, but exposure to TCDD had immediate and long-term effects. Dioxins last for years in the soil, in the water, and therefore the food chain. Now, concerns around the toxicity of Agent Orange began arising in 1964. This is before it was even used in Vietnam. The Federation of American Scientists urged the government not to use this herbicide because it was basically a chemical weapon and would harm indiscriminately. And that constituted chemical warfare. And a lot of other organizations spoke out against the constant use of herbicide, including the National Cancer Institute. And several studies were conducted to see the short and long-term effects of this herbicide, but these studies did not sample Vietnam until 1970. When finally the Herbicide Assessment Commission went to Vietnam and found that, quote, the use of herbicides had been considerably more destructive than previously imagined, and there were indications of serious health effects, unquote. They documented reports of stillbirths and birth defects, noting that these were probably caused by exposure to TCDD. However, the study, The Effects of Herbicide in South Vietnam, concluded that the committee was unable to definitively say that there was a direct correlation of health issues and Agent Orange exposure. Questions around Agent Orange started to arise in the U.S. after veterans and their families reported rashes, skin irritations, miscarriages, type 2 diabetes, psychological issues, birth defects, and cancer in the mid-1970s. And they wondered about the link to Agent Orange exposure. Dr. James Clay, a researcher associated with Operation Ranch Hand, admitted, quote, when we initiated the herbicide program in the 1960s, we were aware of the potential for damage due to dioxin contamination in the herbicide. However, because the material was to be used on the enemy, none of us were overly concerned. We never considered a scenario in which our own personnel would become contaminated with the herbicide, unquote. In 1979, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the 2.4 million veterans that were exposed to Agent Orange. 5 years later, there was a settlement with 7 chemical companies that manufactured it for $180 million in compensations for veterans and next of kin. By the time the Supreme Court approved the settlement in 1988, it had gone up to $240 million. In 1991, President Bush signed the Agent Orange Act, which stated that veterans who suffered diseases caused by Agent Orange were to be treated as a result of wartime service. But what about Vietnam? Well, there was obviously massive environmental devastation that came from the use of Agent Orange. There was also death from exposure at 400,000 people. 500,000 children were reportedly born with serious birth defects, and 2 million people suffered or are suffering from cancer and other illnesses caused by Agent Orange. In 2004, a group of Vietnamese citizens filed a class action lawsuit against over 30 chemical companies, some of which had already settled in the U.S. case. It sought billions of dollars worth of damages because its use violated international law. In 2005, a federal judge in Brooklyn dismissed the lawsuit, and a final appeal of it was struck down in 2008. Fred A. Wilcox, author of Scorched Earth: Legacies of Chemical Warfare in Vietnam, told the Vietnamese news source VN Express International, quote, the U.S. government refuses to compensate Vietnamese victims of chemical warfare because to do so would mean admitting that the U.S. committed war crimes in Vietnam. That would open the door to lawsuits that would cost the government billions of dollars, unquote. And the U.S. would never admit that they were wrong. And here are my sources.